Rain Foster murdered 5 members of his extended family in their home on Detroit's East Side, executing each victim with a single gunshot to the head. The victims included his brother Michael Foster, his former parents-in-law Robert and Catherine Jones, and his ex-wife's siblings Jennifer and Thomas Jones. The bodies were discovered the following morning when Michael's wife returned from an overnight nursing shift, entering their family home to find a scene of carnage that would forever alter the landscape of their family. What had begun as a bitter custody dispute had escalated into one of the most shocking mass killings in Detroit's recent history, a city already too familiar with violence but still capable of being stunned by such intimate family betrayal. Before we continue with this horrific crime case, I'd like to ask you to subscribe if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light, ensuring that victims' voices are heard and justice is remembered. The Foster family home sat in a working-class neighborhood of Detroit, where modest single-family houses lined streets named after automotive pioneers, a reminder of the city's glory days as the heart of American manufacturing. Rain had grown up in this neighborhood alongside his brother Michael, their childhood home just 3 blocks from where the massacre took place, creating a murderous radius that encompassed his entire life's geography. Neighbors would later report hearing nothing unusual that night, no gunshots or screams, suggesting Rain had used a silencer on the 9mm Glock later recovered from his apartment. The killer had moved through the house with precision, starting in the basement where his brother Michael had been watching television, then methodically working his way upstairs to the bedrooms where the other family members were sleeping, leaving no survivors to identify him. Detective Nathan Palmer arrived at the scene at 7:42 a.m. The October morning unusually cold even for Michigan, his breath visible as he ducked under the police tape and approached the 2-story brick home, now surrounded by patrol cars. The first responders had already secured the scene, their faces ashen as they briefed Palmer on what awaited him inside. 5 victims, all with execution-style gunshot wounds to the head and no signs of forced entry. Palmer, a 15-year veteran of Detroit's Homicide Division, had investigated hundreds of murders in his career, but family annihilations were rare, even in a city that had seen more than its share of violence. The detective noted the family photos lining the entryway wall, smiling faces of people who now lay dead throughout the house, their expressions frozen in those happier moments, like accusations directed at whoever had failed to protect them. What Palmer couldn't know as he began processing the scene was that the key to solving this case was already in police possession, captured by chance and technology. A 911 dispatcher had logged a call at 2:33 a.m. from Michael Foster's cell phone, a call that recorded 47 seconds of audio before disconnecting. The call had been categorized as a possible pocket dial after the dispatcher heard no direct communication, but noted disturbing background noises that prompted her to send officers to the address associated with the number. Those officers had knocked but received no response, and with no sounds of distress audible from outside and no legal cause to force entry, they had marked it as a probable false alarm. Now, as Palmer stood amid the carnage, that 47-second audio clip would become the central piece of evidence in what would prove to be one of Detroit's most notorious family murders. Rain Foster had planned the killings with military precision, having served 4 years in the Army before receiving a general discharge following incidents of insubordination and aggression toward superior officers. His tactical approach was evident in the crime scene. He had cut the home's external security camera wires before entering through the back door using a key his brother had never asked him to return. Rain knew the family's routines intimately. He had selected the one night when Michael's wife was working an overnight shift when all 5 family members would be present, but no children would be in the home. The killer had worn latex gloves and disposable shoe covers, leaving minimal physical evidence behind as he moved room to room with cold efficiency. Rain's only mistake had been failing to notice that when he called out his brother's name before shooting him, Michael's phone in his pocket had activated its emergency call function, silently connecting to 911 and recording what would become the smoking gun in the case against him. The 5 victims had played different roles in the custody battle that had consumed Rain's life for the previous 9 months, but in his mind, they shared equal guilt for his loss. His brother Michael had initially tried to remain neutral in the divorce, but ultimately testified about Rain's verbal abuse toward his ex-wife and children. The Jones parents had provided their daughter shelter when she first left Rain, and had financially supported her legal battle for full custody. Jennifer and Thomas Jones had both given statements to family court about witnessing Rain's controlling behavior and angry outbursts around the children. Rain had lost everything in that courtroom: his wife, his 2 children, his home, and most of his income through support payments. The family that had once welcomed him now united against him, and in Rain's distorted worldview, this betrayal demanded the ultimate retribution. Detroit, with its landscape of abandoned factories and resilient neighborhoods fighting for revival, formed a fitting backdrop for this story of family destruction and bitter revenge. The city had been rebuilding itself for decades, much like the Foster family had attempted to reconstruct itself after the toxic marriage dissolved. The murders occurred in Morningside, a neighborhood struggling to maintain its middle-class identity against the forces of urban decay, where residents looked out for one another, and violent crime had actually been decreasing in recent years. The shock rippled through the community immediately, with neighbors placing flowers on the front porch of the Foster home and organizing a candlelight vigil that drew hundreds on the evening after the bodies were discovered. 5 candles burned at the center of the gathering, their flames flickering in the autumn wind, casting unsteady light on the tearful faces of friends, colleagues, and neighbors who struggled to comprehend how family bonds could unravel so completely. Rain had watched his family from afar in the weeks leading up to the murders, tracking their movements and routines while feeding his growing resentment. His social media accounts, later recovered by investigators, revealed the deterioration of his mental state through increasingly angry and paranoid posts. Many focused on the family court system he believed had conspired against him. Rain had written in one private message to a fellow divorced father, "They think they've won, but they don't understand what they've created." In his apartment, detectives would later find a calendar with October 3rd circled in red. The date, marking exactly 1 month since the final custody ruling, gave his ex-wife sole legal and physical custody of their children. The date held additional significance as it would have been his 10th wedding anniversary, a milestone now transformed into a memorial for 5 lives cut short by his inability to accept loss. The murder weapon, a Glock 19 with an illegally obtained silencer, had been purchased by Rain through an unlicensed private seller 3 weeks before the killings. Ballistics would later confirm that all 5 victims were killed with bullets from this same gun, the casings methodically collected by Rain before he left the scene. The killer had been meticulous in almost every aspect of his crime, yet he had failed to account for technology's capacity to capture truth even when no human witness remained. The pocket-dialed 911 call would prove to be his undoing, an accidental testament captured at the moment of his greatest rage. In those 47 seconds, investigators would find not just evidence, but the chilling sound of Rain Foster's voice speaking his brother's name, followed by a gunshot and then silence, the audio equivalent of a smoking gun that would eventually lead to his capture and conviction. Michael Foster was 35 years old when his life ended at the hands of his older brother, a high school history teacher, beloved by students and colleagues at Detroit's Renaissance High School. In the teacher's lounge, his coffee mug still sat unwashed 4 days after the murder, no one having the heart to remove this small artifact of his daily routine. Michael had taught at Renaissance for 11 years, coaching the debate team to state championships 3 times, and mentoring dozens of students who would become first-generation college graduates. His classroom walls had been covered with historical maps and inspirational quotes about learning from the past, a cruel irony given that he could not foresee the danger posed by his own brother, despite their shared history. As a father, Michael had embodied the patience and engagement that his brother Rain had never managed to develop with his own children. Michael's 2 daughters, ages 7 and 9, had been spared from the massacre only because they were staying at a friend's house for a sleepover on the night of the murders. Their mother, Elaine Foster, had taken the overnight nursing shift that she typically avoided, specifically because Michael had assured her he would be home with his visiting parents-in-law and siblings-in-law. The family had gathered that evening for what was supposed to be a planning session for Thanksgiving, a holiday that would now forever be shadowed by their absence. Michael had been the family peacemaker throughout his life, the mediator who tried to see all sides of conflicts, a quality that perhaps blinded him to the depth of Rain's capacity for violence. Friends described Michael as the better foster brother, though they would only use this phrase in private conversations after the murders. While Rain had struggled with authority, employment, and relationships throughout adulthood, Michael had built a stable career and loving family, achievements that some speculated had fueled his brother's resentment. The brothers had maintained a superficially cordial relationship even after Rain's divorce, with Michael attempting to remain neutral until witnessing concerning behavior that compelled him to testify on behalf of his sister-in-law. In his testimony, which would later be read aloud during Rain's murder trial, Michael had described an incident where Rain had thrown a chair against a wall during a family dinner after being asked about missed child support payments. "I fear his anger is escalating," Michael had testified, "and I no longer feel comfortable with him being unsupervised around my niece and nephew." The other victims, Robert Jones, 68, Catherine Jones, 66, Jennifer Jones, 38, and Thomas Jones, 32, each left behind their own grieving circles of friends, colleagues, and in Jennifer's case, a fiancé who had been planning their wedding for the following spring. Robert had been a retired auto worker who had spent 40 years at Ford's River Rouge complex, while Catherine had operated a successful catering business specializing in traditional Mexican recipes passed down through generations of her family. Jennifer had worked as a dental hygienist and volunteered teaching English to recent immigrants, while Thomas had just completed his master's degree in social work and begun a position with Detroit's Child Protective Services. Each life contained multitudes of connections, achievements, and future plans, all severed in a single night of violence stemming from one man's wounded pride and thirst for revenge. Michael's colleagues at Renaissance High School established a scholarship fund in his name within days of his death, designed to support students pursuing education careers. The initial fundraising goal of $10,000 was surpassed in less than 48 hours, as donations poured in from current and former students, fellow teachers, and community members touched by Michael's dedication to his profession. Principal Diane Hayes spoke at a school assembly honoring Michael's memory. Mr. Foster believed that understanding history was essential to creating a better future. The cruel irony that he fell victim to the very kind of hatred and violence he taught students to recognize and reject is not lost on any of us. The school library, where Michael had spent countless lunch periods helping students with research papers, was renamed the Michael Foster Memorial Library, with a plaque bearing his favorite classroom motto, "The past explains us, it does not define us." Michael and Elaine had met during college at Wayne State University, where they had both worked part-time at the campus bookstore while pursuing their respective degrees in education and nursing. Their wedding 7 years later had been attended by Rain, who served as best man and gave what friends would later recall as an unusually self-centered toast focused more on his relationship with his brother than on the couple being celebrated. Michael and Elaine had built their life in Detroit deliberately, choosing to stay and invest in the city despite opportunities elsewhere, believing in the community's resilience and needing the support of extended family as they raised their daughters. The Foster home had been purchased as a fixer-upper, with Michael spending weekends restoring original woodwork and updating systems, creating the secure family haven that would ultimately become a crime scene. The relationship between the Foster brothers had always been complicated by Rain's resentment and competitiveness, according to childhood friends interviewed after the murders. While Michael excelled academically and socially, Rain struggled with behavioral issues and academic challenges that would later be identified as undiagnosed learning disabilities. Their parents, both deceased before the murders, had reportedly favored Michael, or at least that was Rain's perception, a grievance he carried into adulthood and frequently mentioned even in casual conversations. Rain had been the best man at Michael's wedding, but had missed the birth of both his nieces due to what he claimed were unavoidable work commitments. The pattern of Rain's absence from family milestones contrasted sharply with Michael's consistent presence at Rain's important life events, including standing beside him at his divorce hearing despite the growing family tension. The extended Jones family had welcomed Michael warmly when he married Elaine, incorporating him into their large, close-knit Mexican-American family with its traditions and celebrations. Rain, by contrast, had always remained somewhat on the periphery of these family gatherings, his discomfort with the Spanish language spoken by the older generation creating a barrier he made little effort to overcome. When Rain married Elaine's cousin Maria 13 years before the murders, the families had become doubly intertwined, creating the complex web of relationships that would later make the divorce and custody battle all the more bitter. Maria had sought refuge with her parents when she finally left Rain, taking their 2 children with her, and setting in motion the legal proceedings that Rain came to view as a conspiracy against him by the entire extended family. In the weeks before his death, Michael had expressed concern to colleagues about Rain's increasingly erratic behavior, including late-night phone calls filled with rambling grievances against the family court system. Detroit police would later find that Michael had Googled information about restraining orders 2 days before the murders, though he had not taken any legal action to protect himself or his family. Friends wondered if Michael's natural optimism and belief in his brother's fundamental goodness had prevented him from recognizing the true danger, or if his educator's mindset had led him to believe he could reason with Rain through this crisis. Whatever the case, Michael's final act appeared to be an attempt to speak to his brother, as the 911 recording captured him saying, "Rain, let's talk about this," before the sound of the first gunshot ended the conversation permanently. The Detroit Police Department's response to the 911 call from Michael Foster's phone at 2:33 a.m. initially followed standard procedure for suspected pocket dials with no clear emergency communication. Dispatch operator Tanya Wilson, a 14-year veteran, followed protocol by listening to the full call before categorizing it, noting in her log, "Background noises, male voices, possible argument, unable to establish direct communication." Wilson dispatched officers Marcus Dawson and Patricia Reeves to perform a welfare check at the address associated with the phone number. The officers arrived at 2:52 a.m., observed no signs of disturbance visible from outside the residence, knocked on the door, received no response, and with no legal justification for forced entry, cleared the call as checked and secure at 3:07 a.m. This routine response to what would later prove to be an active crime scene would become the subject of an internal department review, though ultimately The officers were found to have followed existing protocols. When Elaine Foster returned home from her nursing shift at 6:15 a.m. and discovered the bodies, her hysterical 911 call brought a full emergency response to the residents within minutes. First responders described entering a house of horrors where the 5 victims appeared to have been killed in different locations throughout the home, suggesting the perpetrator had moved methodically through the house. Detroit PD immediately established a command center 1 block from the crime scene, with Detective Nathan Palmer designated as lead investigator due to his experience with homicide cases involving multiple victims. Palmer's first action was to request all 911 calls associated with the address from the previous 24 hours, a standard procedure that would yield the crucial pocket dial recording. The detective, known for his methodical approach, told responding officers, "We work this like any other homicide. Evidence, timeline, witnesses, but we move fast because this level of violence suggests someone who might not be finished." Crime scene investigation technicians spent 17 hours processing the Foster home, documenting what led CSI technician Sofia Ramirez characterized as an unusually clean mass murder scene. The killer had left minimal physical evidence, with no fingerprints found and few items disturbed throughout the house. Each victim had been killed with a single gunshot to the head, fired at close range, with no signs of prolonged struggle in any case. The murder weapon was not found at the scene, and all shell casings had been removed, indicating a methodical perpetrator concerned with removing evidence. Blood spatter analysis suggested that Michael Foster, found in the basement family room, had been killed first, with the perpetrator then moving upstairs to kill the other 4 victims in their bedrooms. CSI recovered several fibers and a partial shoe print from the kitchen floor, but the most significant evidence collection occurred when Detective Palmer, reviewing the night's 911 calls, discovered the 2:33 a.m. pocket dial from Michael Foster's phone. The 47-second audio recording became the centerpiece of the investigation, a chance digital witness to a crime that otherwise left few clues. Audio forensics specialist Dr. James Chen was immediately brought in to enhance and analyze the recording, working through the night at Detroit PD's Digital Evidence Lab. The enhanced audio revealed several critical elements. Michael Foster's voice saying, "Rain, let's talk about this." Another male voice responding with, "You sided with them, Mike?" The sound of what audio experts confirmed was a suppressed gunshot, and throughout the recording, the distinctive barking of a dog that was not present at the crime scene. Palmer, listening to the enhanced audio, immediately recognized the Rain reference as potentially identifying Rain Foster, the victim's brother, as the killer. The recording also captured footsteps moving across the room, a door opening, and what analysts believed was the sound of shell casings being collected from the floor. While the audio evidence pointed toward Rain Foster as the prime suspect, Palmer assembled a team to build a comprehensive case beyond this single piece of evidence. Detectives interviewed neighbors who reported seeing no unusual vehicles or persons near the home on the night of the murders, with one exception. Karen Lewandowski, who lived directly across the street, told detectives she had been awakened around 2:30 a.m. by the sound of a dog barking, not an unusual occurrence in the neighborhood, except that the barking seemed to be coming from inside the Foster home, which didn't have a dog. Lewandowski looked out her window and observed a dark-colored sedan parked 2 houses down, but could not identify its make or model in the darkness. This statement, when combined with the dog barking captured on the 911 call, provided investigators with another avenue to pursue. Detective Palmer dispatched officers to Rain Foster's apartment complex on Detroit's west side at 11:42 a.m., approximately 5 hours after the bodies were discovered. The officers were instructed to conduct surveillance only, not to approach or contact Foster, as Palmer worked to gather sufficient evidence for an arrest warrant. Background checks revealed that Rain Foster legally owned 3 firearms, including a Glock 19 9mm pistol, the most common caliber used in handgun homicides, and potentially matching the wounds observed on the victims. Palmer also discovered that Rain had been involved in a bitter custody battle with his ex-wife Maria Jones, cousin to Elaine Foster, and that all 5 victims had testified against Rain in family court proceedings that had concluded with him losing all custody rights just 1 month before the murders. The detective noted in his case file, "Suspect has clear motive, means, and opportunity. Audio evidence strongly suggests his presence at the crime scene at time of murders." The investigation accelerated when officers conducting surveillance reported that Rain Foster had left his apartment with a large duffel bag and placed it in the trunk of his black 2018 Honda Accord. Concerned that the suspect might be attempting to flee or dispose of evidence, Palmer expedited the arrest warrant process, working directly with the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office to secure authorization based on the 911 audio evidence and the established connection between the suspect and victims. Judge Terrence Washington signed the warrant at 2:07 p.m., and tactical officers moved in to arrest Rain Foster as he attempted to leave his apartment complex parking lot. The arrest was executed without incident, with Foster offering no resistance when surrounded by police vehicles. The duffel bag recovered from his trunk contained clothing, toiletries, $4,200 in cash, and printed directions to a cabin in northern Michigan owned by a former Army colleague of Foster's. The most compelling breakthrough in the early investigation came when officers executing a search warrant at Rain Foster's apartment discovered a German Shepherd dog in a back bedroom. The dog, named Kaiser, began barking when officers entered, and Detective Palmer immediately recognized the distinctive bark as matching that captured on the 911 call. A neighbor confirmed that the dog belonged to Rain Foster, and that he always took the dog with him when he visited family members. Animal Control was called to take custody of the dog, and audio recordings of Kaiser's bark were made to compare with the 911 audio. In the apartment, investigators also found a gun cleaning kit with recent residue, a box of 9mm ammunition, missing several rounds, a silencer hidden in an air vent, and a pair of boots with traces of what appeared to be blood on the soles. Rain Foster's cell phone was seized, with initial examination showing it had been turned off between 1 a.m. and 4:30 a.m. on the night of the murders, a deliberate gap in his digital footprint during the critical time frame. As the first day of investigation concluded, Detective Palmer had established a preliminary timeline of events, identified and arrested a prime suspect, and collected significant physical and audio evidence linking Rain Foster to the crime scene. The pocket-dialed 911 call, initially categorized as a non-emergency, had become the linchpin of the investigation, providing investigators with a real-time audio recording of what appeared to be the first of the 5 murders. At the evening briefing with his investigative team, Palmer emphasized the importance of building a case that could stand independently of the audio evidence. The 911 call gets us in the door, but we need to build walls and a roof around it. Forensics, motive, timeline, everything solid enough that even if the audio were thrown out, we'd still get a conviction. As night fell on Detroit, the scale of the tragedy was becoming clear to the community, while the investigation into one of the city's most shocking family massacres had only just begun. Detective Nathan Palmer sat in the dimly lit audio lab of the Detroit Police Department, listening to the enhanced 911 recording for the 12th time, his expression growing increasingly certain with each replay. The audio forensics team had cleaned up the background noise, amplifying the voices and other crucial sounds that would form the backbone of their case against Rain Foster. "Play it again from the 20-second mark," Palmer instructed Dr. James Chen, focusing on the moment when the suspected killer's voice became clearest in the recording. The enhanced audio revealed Rain's distinctive speech pattern, including a slight stutter on hard consonants that family members would later confirm had been present since childhood. Palmer made notes as he listened, the dog barking 3 times, the sound of a slide being racked on what could be a 9mm handgun, and most damning of all, the clear statement, "You sided with them, Mike," followed by what audio experts had confirmed was a suppressed gunshot. The Foster brothers had grown up in Detroit's Morningside neighborhood, their childhood home just 3 blocks from the murder scene, their lives intertwined with the city's struggle and resilience. Rain's yearbook photos showed the progression from a smiling child to a sullen teenager, his academic records revealing a pattern of declining performance and increasing disciplinary issues. After high school, Rain had joined the Army, serving 4 years before receiving a general discharge. Following incidents his service record described as patterns of insubordination and inability to function within the command structure. Detroit PD background checks revealed Rain had held 7 different jobs in the 9 years since his military service, never lasting more than 18 months in any position and often leaving after conflicts with management. His most recent employment had been at an auto parts warehouse, a job he had lost 3 weeks before the murders for excessive absences that coincided with his final custody hearings. Rain's ex-wife, Maria Jones, provided detectives with critical insights into his psychological state during a 4-hour interview conducted at a secure location where she and her children had been moved for protection. Maria described Rain as obsessed with perceived slights and unable to accept any responsibility for our marriage failing. She shared text messages Rain had sent in the weeks following the final custody ruling, including one sent just 5 days before the murders that read, "You think your family protected you? They can't protect you forever. Nobody takes my kids from me." Maria had not reported these messages to police at the time, believing them to be empty threats from a man who had always been more talk than action. She broke down crying when detectives played a portion of the 911 audio, immediately identifying the voice as Rain's and confirming that the barking dog was Kaiser, the German Shepherd Rain had acquired during their marriage and retained in the divorce. The breakthrough connecting Rain's dog to the crime scene came from Karen Lewandowski's witness statement about hearing a dog barking inside the Foster home around the time of the murders, corroborating the audio captured on the 911 call. Detective Palmer arranged a lineup of 5 audio recordings of different German Shepherds barking, including Kaiser's, which Lewandowski identified with 90% certainty as the bark she heard that night. 3 other neighbors also confirmed that Rain Foster owned a distinctive-looking German Shepherd that had accompanied him on previous visits to his brother's home. Palmer had animal control officers record Kaiser's barking under various conditions, creating samples that Dr. Chen could compare to the 911 audio using spectrographic analysis. The forensic comparison yielded what Chen described as a 97% probability match between the reference samples and the barking captured on the emergency call, providing scientific weight to this unusual form of identification evidence. Rain Foster's digital footprint revealed a man increasingly consumed by resentment toward the family members who would become his victims. His internet search history, obtained through warrants for his Google and social media accounts, showed queries for undetectable poisons, how to make a homemade silencer, and states with no extradition to Michigan. Most concerning were searches from 2 weeks before the murders for how long does it take someone to die from a gunshot to the head, and famous family annihilators. Rain's Facebook messages with a private group of divorced fathers contained increasingly violent rhetoric, including one post where he wrote, "The family courts are rigged against men. Sometimes the only justice is the justice you make yourself." While none of these digital breadcrumbs explicitly declared his intention to murder his family members, they painted a portrait of a man contemplating violence as a solution to his perceived injustices. The murder weapon remained missing in the initial days of the investigation, but ballistics experts examining the bullets recovered from the victims determined they were 9mm rounds, consistent with the Glock 19 registered to Rain Foster. A search of Rain's bank records revealed a $600 cash withdrawal 3 weeks before the murders, and a confidential informant in Detroit's illegal gun trade identified Rain from a photo lineup as having purchased a silencer around that time. Cell tower data placed Rain's phone in the vicinity of his apartment until approximately 1:00 a.m. on the night of the murders, when the device was turned off, creating a suspicious gap in his digital trail until 4:30 a.m., when the phone was reactivated nearly 5 miles from the crime scene. When confronted with this gap during initial questioning, Rain claimed he had been sleeping with my phone off like I do every night. But 3 months of his cell data showed this was the only night his phone had been deactivated during sleeping hours. Rain's apartment yielded additional evidence linking him to the murders beyond the German Shepherd whose bark was captured on the 911 call. Crime scene technicians discovered microscopic blood spatter on a pair of boots hidden in the back of Rain's closet, and preliminary DNA testing indicated the blood likely belonged to Michael Foster. A gun cleaning kit found in Rain's bathroom contained residue consistent with recent use, and chemical tests revealed traces of gunpowder on a jacket hanging in Rain's hall closet. Most damning was the recovery of the silencer hidden inside an air vent and wrapped in oily rags, with Rain's fingerprints clearly visible on the metal surface. The silencer, while not unequivocally linked to the murders without the weapon itself, demonstrated both Rain's access to such a device and his attempt to conceal it from authorities, strengthening the circumstantial case being built by Detective Palmer and his team. The possible murder weapon was recovered 3 days after the murders, when a city sanitation worker found a Glock 19 pistol in a storm drain 8 blocks from Rain Foster's apartment complex. The serial number had been partially filed down, but remained legible enough for forensic technicians to confirm it matched the firearm registered to Rain. Ballistics testing confirmed the recovered Glock was the weapon used in all 5 murders, with distinctive markings on the bullets removed from the victims' matching test fires from the recovered gun. The storm drain location was consistent with the route Rain would likely have taken when returning to his apartment after the murders, based on traffic camera footage showing his Honda Accord traveling in that direction at 3:42 a.m. on October 3rd. Rain had apparently believed the weapon would remain hidden in the city's labyrinthine drainage system, not accounting for the drought conditions that had lowered water levels and made the gun visible to maintenance workers inspecting the system after recent complaints of localized flooding. As evidence mounted against Rain Foster, investigators focused on establishing a definitive timeline of the night of the murders. Security cameras at Rain's apartment complex showed his Honda Accord leaving the parking lot at 1:17 a.m. on October 3rd and returning at 4:03 a.m. A gas station surveillance camera captured Rain filling his tank at 1:29 a.m., wearing dark clothing and appearing calm as he paid cash inside the store. Traffic cameras tracked the Honda's movement toward Michael Foster's neighborhood, though the vehicle disappeared from surveillance coverage approximately 8 blocks from the crime scene, suggesting Rain had parked at a distance and approached on foot to avoid detection. The 911 call placed the first murder at 2:33 a.m., giving Rain approximately 1 hour to travel from the gas station to the murder scene, approach the house undetected, and begin his attack on his sleeping family members. By the end of the first week of investigation, Detective Palmer had assembled a compelling case against Rain Foster based on audio, digital, physical, and circumstantial evidence. The pocket-dialed 911 call remained the centerpiece, capturing not only Rain's voice and his dog's distinctive bark, but the actual sound of the first murder being committed. Rain's motive was clearly established through the recent custody battle in which all 5 victims had testified against him, resulting in his complete loss of parental rights. The recovered murder weapon, silencer, and bloody boots provided physical evidence linking Rain directly to the crimes. Cell phone data, security camera footage, and witness statements established his movement on the night of the murders, with a suspicious gap in his digital footprint precisely during the time frame when the killings occurred. As Palmer prepared to present the case to the Wayne County Prosecutor's Office, he told his investigative team, "In 15 years working homicide, I've never seen a suspect leave behind an actual recording of their crime. Rain Foster's voice on that 911 call will be what convicts him of these murders." Wayne County Prosecutor Victoria Fisher leaned forward in her chair, her eyes fixed on the audio waveform moving across the computer screen as the 911 recording played through high-quality speakers in her office. Her expression remained professionally stoic, but her hand involuntarily tightened around her pen as the enhanced audio captured the moment of Michael Foster's murder. "That's enough," she said quietly when the recording ended, turning to Detective Palmer, who sat across from her desk. "You're right, Nathan. This is extraordinarily compelling evidence." The 47-second recording had captured not just the crime, but established the identity of the perpetrator through his voice and his dog's distinctive bark, creating what Fisher would later call a digital smoking gun. The prosecutor had built her career on meticulous case preparation, and despite the strength of this central piece of evidence, she immediately began outlining additional investigative steps to create an airtight case around the audio recording. The forensic analysis of the 911 call continued to yield critical evidence as audio experts applied advanced techniques to extract every possible detail from the recording. Dr. James Chen's team isolated background sounds that initially seemed like meaningless noise, but upon enhancement revealed the distinctive click of a key in the back door lock, suggesting Rain Foster had used a key to enter his brother's home rather than forcing entry. This detail aligned with statements from Elaine Foster that Michael had given Rain a spare key years earlier and never asked for its return, even after tensions grew between the brothers during the custody battle. The audio also captured footsteps moving across hardwood floors at a pace consistent with someone trying to move quietly, followed by the creak of the specific basement step that family members confirmed had a distinctive sound. These acoustic details allowed investigators to reconstruct Rain's path through the house with remarkable precision, strengthening the narrative they would eventually present to a jury. The motive for the quintuple homicide grew clearer as investigators obtained complete records from the family court proceedings that had consumed Rain Foster's life for the previous 9 months. Court transcripts revealed that all 5 victims had provided testimony describing Rain's volatile behavior, instances of verbal abuse toward his ex-wife and children, and his increasingly erratic conduct as the custody battle progressed. Judge Marissa Hernandez's final ruling cited this testimony as central to her decision to grant Maria Jones sole legal and physical custody of the children, with Rain limited to supervised visitation once monthly. The judge's written opinion included language that would have been particularly devastating to Rain's self-image. The respondent appears unable to prioritize his children's well-being above his own emotional needs, displaying patterns consistent with narcissistic personality traits that render him currently unsuitable for shared parenting responsibilities. Rain had stormed out of the courtroom after this ruling was read, shouting that the whole system is corrupt, before being restrained by court officers. Forensic examination of Rain Foster's digital devices revealed the escalating rage that preceded the murders, with his online searches becoming increasingly focused on methods of violence and revenge. His YouTube history showed multiple views of videos about notorious family annihilators, while his Netflix account logged repeated viewings of crime documentaries featuring familial murders. Most disturbing was a digital journal found on Rain's laptop, hidden in an encrypted folder, but recovered by Detroit PD's cyber unit, containing entries that chronicled his growing resentment. One entry, dated just 2 weeks before the murders, read, "They think they've destroyed me by taking my kids, but they don't understand what happens when you corner someone with nothing left to lose. Mike was supposed to be on my side. He's my brother. Instead, he stood with them. They all did. Family loyalty means nothing to these people." The journal never explicitly stated his intention to commit murder, but entries referenced making them pay and ensuring they understand the consequences of their betrayal. The recovery of the murder weapon from the storm drain 8 blocks from Rain's apartment provided investigators with crucial physical evidence linking him directly to the killings. Ballistics experts confirmed through microscopic analysis that the distinctive markings on the bullets recovered from all 5 victims matched test-fired rounds from the Glock 19. The partial serial number matched Rain's registered firearm, and his fingerprints were found beneath the gun's removable backstrap, a location unlikely to be wiped during hasty cleaning. The silencer recovered from Rain's apartment air vent matched the threading on the recovered Glock, and residue analysis indicated it had been used recently. Most damning was the DNA evidence. Blood from 4 of the 5 victims was found in microscopic droplets on the gun's barrel and trigger guard, suggesting that blood spatter had occurred during the close-range executions and remained even after Rain's attempts to clean the weapon. The timeline of the murders was reconstructed with increasing precision as investigators correlated multiple data sources to track Rain Foster's movements on the night of October 3rd. License plate readers had captured his Honda Accord driving within 6 blocks of his brother's home at 2:17 a.m., approximately 16 minutes before the 911 call. A neighbor's doorbell camera had recorded a man matching Rain's description walking along the street at 2:22 a.m., accompanied by what appeared to be a German Shepherd on a leash. The 911 call placed the first murder at 2:33 a.m., and another doorbell camera captured the same man and dog moving rapidly in the opposite direction at 3:18 a.m., suggesting Rain spent approximately 45 minutes inside the home executing his family members and attempting to remove evidence. Cell tower data showed Rain's phone reactivating at 4:30 a.m. in a location consistent with the route he would have taken after discarding the murder weapon in the storm drain, and security footage from his apartment complex confirmed his vehicle returning at 4:03 a.m. Rain's behavior in the days following the murders provided additional circumstantial evidence of his guilt, as he made preparations suggesting plans for either escape or suicide. His internet search history showed queries for countries with no extradition and surviving in the wilderness in the 48 hours after the killings but before his arrest. Rain had withdrawn nearly all remaining funds from his bank account, packed essential belongings, and printed directions to a remote cabin in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, owned by a former Army colleague. This colleague, interviewed by detectives, confirmed that Rain had called him the morning after the murders, asking if the cabin was currently occupied and whether the offer to use it any time was still good. Most tellingly, Rain had not contacted any family members after news of the murders broke, nor had he attempted to call his ex-wife to ensure his children were safe, behavior profoundly inconsistent with innocence, as Prosecutor Fisher noted in her case notes. The forensic evidence continued to accumulate as laboratory analysis was completed on items recovered from Rain's apartment and vehicle. The boots found hidden in his closet contained blood matching Michael Foster's DNA in the tread pattern, consistent with Rain stepping in blood spatter after shooting his brother at close range. Fibers recovered from the Foster home matched the distinctive weave of a jacket found in Rain's apartment, placing him at the scene. GSR, gunshot residue, was detected on clothing found in Rain's laundry hamper despite signs of recent washing, and soil samples from his car floor mats matched the distinctive composition of soil from the area around the storm drain where the murder weapon was recovered. Each piece of evidence strengthened the connections between Rain, the crime scene, and the murder weapon, creating what Detective Palmer described in his final case report as multiple independent lines of evidence, any one of which would be compelling, but together form an overwhelming case for conviction. As the investigation entered its second week, Prosecutor Victoria Fisher convened her trial team to assess the strength of the case against Rain Foster. The evidence board in her office displayed photographs of each victim alongside the timeline of events, physical evidence, and witness statements. "What we have here," Fisher told her assistant prosecutors, "is as close to an open and shut case as I've seen in my career." The 911 call remained the emotional center of the case, capturing the actual moment when Rain Foster executed his brother in revenge for testimony in a custody case. The recording contained Rain's voice, his dog's distinctive bark, and the sound of the murder itself, evidence that Fisher knew would be devastating when played for a jury. "But we're not relying solely on that recording," she continued, pointing to the multiple corroborating evidence threads. "We've built a case that connects Rain Foster to these murders through audio, visual, digital, physical, and circumstantial evidence, all pointing to the same conclusion. He murdered 5 family members in a calculated act of revenge." Rain Foster sat in the stark interrogation room of Detroit Police Headquarters, his posture unnaturally stiff as he stared at the two-way mirror on the wall. He had been arrested 6 hours earlier as he attempted to leave his apartment complex with a duffel bag containing clothes, cash, and directions to a remote cabin in northern Michigan. The tactical arrest team had surrounded his vehicle at the complex exit, weapons drawn, ordering him to exit with his hands visible. Rain had offered no resistance, his expression blank as officers handcuffed him and recited his Miranda rights. Now dressed in an orange jumpsuit after processing, he waited in silence as Detective Nathan Palmer prepared for what would be one of the most important interrogations of his career. The detective had deliberately allowed Rain to sit alone for nearly an hour, a psychological tactic to increase anxiety, before questioning began. Palmer entered the interrogation room carrying a thin file folder, accompanied by Detective Sophia Ramirez, an experienced interrogator known for her ability to build rapport with suspects. "Rain Foster," Palmer began, his voice professionally neutral as he activated the recording equipment, stating the date, time, and names of all present for the record. "You've been advised of your rights and have indicated you understand them. You've declined an attorney at this time, is that correct?" Rain nodded silently, then muttered, "Yes," when prompted to give a verbal response. Palmer began with standard biographical questions, confirming Rain's address, employment status, and relationship to the victims, establishing a baseline of communication before transitioning to the substance of the case. Rain's responses were clipped but cooperative, his eyes occasionally darting to the folder Palmer had placed on the table but not yet opened. The interrogation strategy shifted abruptly when Palmer played the enhanced 911 recording without preamble, filling the small room with the sounds of Rain's own voice calling his brother by name, followed by the distinctive bark of his German Shepherd and the muffled pop of a silenced gunshot. Rain's face remained impressively impassive as the audio played, but the detectives noted his hands tightening into fists beneath the table, the knuckles whitening with pressure. "That's your voice, Rain," Palmer stated rather than asked. "That's your dog Kaiser barking. That's you murdering your brother Michael at 2:33 a.m. on October 3rd. Rain maintained eye contact with the detective, his expression hardening into something resembling defiance. "Sounds like a lot of noise to me," he replied after a calculated pause. Could be anyone talking to Mike. Could be any dog barking. You've got nothing." Palmer methodically presented the evidence linking Rain to the crime scene. The ballistics matching his registered Glock 19, the blood spatter on his boots, the silencer recovered from his apartment vent, the cell phone data showing his movements that night. With each new piece of evidence, Rain's demeanor shifted subtly from defiance to calculation, his eyes constantly moving as if reassessing his position. "You planned this carefully," Palmer observed, "but you made one critical mistake. You didn't realize that when you called out Mike's name, his phone in his pocket dialed 911. Technology betrayed you, Rain. Your own voice convicted you before you even left the house that night." Rain's first display of genuine emotion came at this revelation, a flash of surprise quickly masked by a return to calculated neutrality. "I want to know what happens to my dog," he said, changing the subject abruptly. "Kaiser didn't do anything wrong." Detective Ramirez, who had remained silent until this point, leaned forward slightly. "Rain, we understand this started with the custody case. We've read the court transcripts where your brother and in-laws testified against you." Her tone was conversational, almost sympathetic, a deliberate contrast to Palmer's more confrontational approach. "It must have felt like your entire family betrayed you. Anyone would be angry in that situation." This change in tactic elicited the first substantial response from Rain, who nodded slowly before speaking. "You have no idea what they took from me. My own brother, my flesh and blood, stood in that courtroom and called me unfit to be around my own children." Rain's voice remained controlled, but his eyes had darkened with barely suppressed rage. "The whole family lined up against me, one after another, telling their lies. And that judge, she just sat there nodding, already decided before I even had my say." Palmer recognized the opening and redirected the conversation toward motive. "Tell us about the custody hearing, Rain. What happened that day?" For the next 27 minutes, Rain described in detail the final court session that had resulted in his loss of custody, his narrative increasingly animated as he recounted perceived injustices. He described how each family member had stabbed him in the back, particularly focusing on his brother Michael's testimony about witnessing Rain's angry outbursts. Throughout this extended monologue, Rain never explicitly admitted to the murders, but repeatedly used phrases like, "They got what was coming," and "justice has its own way of finding people." The detectives allowed him to continue uninterrupted, recognizing that while he was not confessing, he was establishing motive in his own words, creating testimony that would later prove damaging at trial. The interrogation strategy shifted again when Palmer opened the file folder and removed 5 photographs, placing them on the table facing Rain. Each showed one of the victims as they had been found at the crime scene: Michael Foster on the basement floor, the 4 Jones family members in their beds, each with a single gunshot wound to the head. Rain's eyes moved from photo to photo, his expression unreadable as Palmer spoke. 5 people, Rain. 5 lives ended because you couldn't accept losing in court." Rain remained silent, his gaze now fixed on the photograph of his brother. "Was it worth it?" Palmer pressed. "Did killing them change the custody ruling? Did it get your children back?" Rain finally looked up, his eyes cold as he responded, "My children were already gone. They made sure of that. What happens to me now doesn't matter." When confronted directly about the evidence recovered from his apartment, particularly the silencer with his fingerprints, Rain's defensive posture began to shift toward calculated admissions. "I own guns legally. I have the right to protect myself," he stated. When Ramirez pointed out that silencers are illegal in Michigan without special permits, Rain shrugged. "Maybe I bought it from a guy. That doesn't make me a killer." This pattern continued as detectives presented each piece of evidence. Rain would offer alternative, often implausible explanations, or dismiss the evidence entirely without directly denying involvement in the murders. His most revealing statement came when Palmer mentioned the journal entries found on his laptop, describing his feelings of betrayal by his family. "Those were private thoughts," Rain said, his voice rising slightly. "Everyone thinks things they don't act on. Having angry thoughts isn't a crime." The pivotal moment in the interrogation came 3 hours into the session, when Palmer played the 911 audio for a second time, now accompanied by enhanced analysis identifying Rain's voice with 99% certainty according to FBI voice recognition software. As the audio ended, Palmer leaned forward. "We have you at the scene, Rain. We have your voice. We have your dog barking. We have the murder weapon registered to you. We have your blood-spattered boots. We have your journal detailing your resentment toward the victims. The only thing we don't have is why you took your dog with you that night." This unexpected question, focusing on a peripheral detail rather than the murders themselves, momentarily broke through Rain's calculated facade. "Kaiser gets anxious when left alone too long," he replied automatically, then immediately realized he had placed himself with the dog at the crime scene. He fell silent, his jaw tightening, as he recognized his mistake. 7 hours into the interrogation, with Rain showing signs of fatigue but still maintaining his composure, Palmer decided to play his final card. "Before we conclude, there's something you should hear," he said, pressing play on a new audio file. The room filled with the sound of a child's voice. Rain's 8-year-old son, in a recorded statement made that morning. "I just want to know why my dad hurt Uncle Mike and Grandma and Grandpa. What did we do wrong?" Rain's carefully maintained facade cracked visibly, his eyes widening and then filling with tears that he quickly blinked away. "Turn it off," he said hoarsely. When Palmer complied, Rain sat in silence for nearly a full minute before speaking again. "My children weren't supposed to know. They were supposed to think it was a break-in, a random thing." This statement, falling just short of an explicit confession, would later be highlighted by prosecutors as a damning admission of both guilt and premeditation. As the interrogation concluded, Rain Foster had not officially confessed to the murders, but had made numerous incriminating statements that established motive, opportunity, and consciousness of guilt. His final words before requesting an attorney, coming nearly 8 hours into the session, were perhaps the most revealing. "They took everything from me, my wife, my kids, my dignity. They all sided against me in that courtroom, looking at me like I was nothing. Now they know. Now everyone knows you don't destroy a man's life without consequences." Detective Palmer ended the recording, noting the time, and that the suspect was now invoking his right to counsel. As Rain was led back to his cell to await arraignment, Palmer turned to Ramirez in the now empty interrogation room. "He never once asked about his children's welfare after the murders," Palmer observed. "Not once did he express concern for whether they were safe or how they were coping. That's not a father who killed to protect his family. That's a narcissist who killed out of wounded pride." The Frank Murphy Hall of Justice stood imposing against Detroit's gray November sky, its brutalist concrete architecture projecting the stern face of the legal system to the city it served. Camera crews had assembled before dawn, jostling for position on the courthouse steps to capture the arrival of Rain Foster for the first day of what local media had dubbed the family betrayal trial. Inside courtroom 4B, Judge Eleanor Simmons reviewed pre-trial motions as her courtroom filled with journalists, legal observers, and family members of both the victims and the defendant. The high-profile nature of the case had prompted heightened security measures, with additional officers posted throughout the building and spectators passing through 2 separate security screenings before entering the courtroom. Court officers directed the victims' family members, including Elaine Foster and Maria Jones with her 2 children, to seats on the left side of the gallery, while the handful of Rain's supporters, mostly former military colleagues, were seated on the right, creating a physical division that mirrored the emotional chasm at the heart of the case. Wayne County Prosecutor Victoria Fisher arrived early, arranging materials at the prosecution table with methodical precision. Her reputation for thorough preparation and commanding courtroom presence had made her one of Detroit's most respected prosecutors, with a conviction rate exceeding 90% in homicide cases. Fisher had personally chosen to lead this prosecution rather than assigning it to one of her deputies, recognizing both the emotional impact of the case on the community and the opportunity to secure justice for 5 victims in a single trial. Her strategy, outlined in detailed notes visible on her legal pad, emphasized 3 central elements: the damning 911 audio evidence capturing Rain's voice at the murder scene, the recovered murder weapon registered to Rain with victim's DNA present, and the clear motive established through the bitter custody battle in which all 5 victims had testified against the defendant. As Fisher arranged photographs of the victims that would be shown during her opening statement, she nodded respectfully to Elaine Foster and Maria Jones in the gallery, silently conveying her commitment to securing justice for their loved ones. Defense attorney Lawrence Davidoff entered the courtroom minutes before the scheduled start, his imposing physical presence drawing attention as he strode confidently to the defense table. Known for taking on difficult, high-profile cases, Davidoff had been retained using funds from Rain Foster's military pension and contributions from former Army colleagues. His defense strategy faced significant challenges given the overwhelming evidence, but pretrial motions had revealed his approach, attacking the 911 call as potentially manipulated, questioning the chain of custody for physical evidence, and most controversially, suggesting that Rain suffered from PTSD from his military service that had been exacerbated by the stress of the custody battle. This diminished capacity argument had been met with skepticism during preliminary hearings, particularly since Rain had received a general rather than honorable discharge and had never sought treatment for PTSD in the years since leaving the military. Davidoff placed a reassuring hand on Rain's shoulder as the defendant was led into the courtroom by sheriff's deputies, whispering brief instructions as Rain, dressed in a navy blue suit that couldn't quite disguise his prison pallor, took his seat. At precisely 9:00 a.m., Judge Eleanor Simmons entered the courtroom, her reputation for no-nonsense efficiency preceding her as she took the bench, and called the court to order. Case number 22-CR-7841, People of the State of Michigan versus Rain Foster, the clerk announced, officially beginning proceedings in one of Detroit's most notorious murder cases. Judge Simmons addressed the crowded courtroom with a stern warning about maintaining decorum regardless of emotional testimony, emphasizing that outbursts would result in immediate removal. The judge then addressed preliminary matters, including her ruling on the defense's motion to exclude the 911 recording. The court finds that the 911 audio evidence meets all standards for authenticity and reliability. The recording will be admissible in its entirety. This critical ruling represented the first significant victory for the prosecution, ensuring their strongest piece of evidence would be presented to the jury. The jury selection process had been completed the previous week after an exhaustive 4-day examination of over 150 potential jurors, resulting in a panel of 12 jurors and 4 alternates that roughly reflected Detroit's diverse demographics. The selected jurors filed in solemnly, taking their seats as Judge Simmons reminded them of their oath to decide the case solely on evidence presented in court, without influence from media coverage or personal bias. The jurors' expressions ranged from nervous to resolute as they faced the defendant for the first time in the trial setting, several unable to maintain eye contact with Rain Foster, while others studied him intently. Court officers distributed notepads and pens to each juror as the judge completed her preliminary instructions. You will hear evidence of shocking and disturbing crimes. Your duty is not to judge based on emotion, but on facts and law as presented in this courtroom. With that understanding, we will proceed with opening statements. Prosecutor Victoria Fisher approached the jury box with measured steps, her crimson blazer standing out against the courtroom's subdued colors. October 3rd, 2022, she began, her voice filling the silent courtroom. A date that should have been nothing more than a Monday in autumn became instead the date when Rain Foster executed a methodical plan to murder 5 members of his family in cold blood. Fisher outlined the prosecution's case with precision, detailing how Rain had entered his brother's home with a key, moving room to kill each victim with a single shot to the head. The prosecutor held up a large photograph of each victim as she named them: Michael Foster, Robert Jones, Catherine Jones, Jennifer Jones, and Thomas Jones, humanizing them beyond crime scene statistics. The evidence will show that the defendant murdered these 5 people for one reason: revenge. They had testified truthfully in his custody case, resulting in his loss of parental rights, and Rain Foster decided that their lives was the price they would pay for that testimony. Fisher's opening statement reached its emotional crescendo as she prepared to introduce the 911 evidence, her voice dropping slightly to draw the jury forward in their seats. Ladies and gentlemen, in most murder trials, prosecutors must reconstruct what happened through physical evidence and witness testimony. In this extraordinary case, you will hear the murder itself. She paused, allowing the weight of this statement to register. Michael Foster's phone in his pocket as he confronted his brother in the basement of his home accidentally dialed 911 at 2:33 a.m. That call captured 47 seconds of audio, including the defendant's voice calling his brother by name, his dog barking in the background, and the sound of the gunshot that ended Michael Foster's life. Several jurors visibly reacted to this revelation, one woman bringing her hand to her mouth in shock. This is not a case about whether Rain Foster committed these murders. The evidence, beginning with his own voice captured at the crime scene, will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that he did. This is a case about justice for 5 lives, ended by a man who valued his wounded pride more than his own family's right to live. Defense attorney Lawrence Davidoff approached the jury with a deliberately different energy, thoughtful, measured, and contemplative, rather than Fisher's more dynamic presence. The prosecution has just painted a picture of a monster, a cold-blooded killer who executed 5 people out of pure revenge, he began. What they have not told you is the story of Rain Foster, decorated military veteran, father, brother, and son, whose life spiraled into darkness after a bitter custody battle stripped him of his children. Davidoff acknowledged the difficulty of the case. Let me be clear, this is a tragedy of immense proportions. 5 people lost their lives, and nothing can diminish that loss. His strategy became evident as he continued, not directly denying his client's actions, but instead focusing on Rain's mental state. The evidence will show that Rain Foster was suffering from untreated post-traumatic stress disorder from his military service, a condition exacerbated by the emotional trauma of losing his children in a custody case where his own family testified against him. Davidoff directly addressed the 911 recording, knowing it would be the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. You will indeed hear this recording, and it is disturbing. But you will also hear expert testimony about its limitations, about audio anomalies that raise questions about its interpretation, about the possibility of other voices present, about alternate explanations for what occurred that night. This approach signaled the defense's intention to create reasonable doubt around the prosecution's narrative rather than denying Rain's presence at the scene. Davidoff concluded by framing the case as a tragedy rather than a simple criminal act. This case is not about whether terrible events occurred. They did. 5 people lost their lives and families are shattered. What this case is about is understanding the true mental state of Rain Foster on that night. A man broken by loss, suffering from untreated psychological trauma, and pushed beyond the limits of rational thought by a system that he believed had conspired to destroy his life. Justice requires not just accountability, but understanding. I ask you to keep your minds open to the full complexity of this tragic case. Judge Simmons instructed the prosecution to call its first witness, and Victoria Fisher announced, "The people called Detective Nathan Palmer to the stand." Palmer entered from the witness room, his demeanor professional, and contained as he was sworn in. Fisher began by establishing Palmer's credentials: 15 years with Detroit Homicide, hundreds of cases investigated, specialized training in crime scene analysis, and homicide investigation. The detective described his arrival at the Foster home on the morning of October 3rd, his voice steady as he detailed the discovery of the 5 victims in different locations throughout the house. Palmer's testimony was accompanied by crime scene photographs displayed on monitors visible to the jury but shielded from gallery spectators, showing the clinical evidentiary aspects of the scenes while minimizing their graphic nature. Several jurors nonetheless winced at images of Michael Foster's body on the basement floor, the single gunshot wound to his head, visible despite the crime scene technician's evidence markers partially obscuring the worst details. The courtroom fell completely silent as Fisher approached the critical moment in Palmer's testimony. "Detective, I'm going to ask you about evidence item number 1 in this case. Can you tell the jury what this item is?" Palmer leaned slightly toward the microphone. Evidence item number 1 is a 911 call received at 2:33 a.m. on October 3rd, 2022, from the cell phone registered to victim Michael Foster. Fisher methodically established the chain of custody for the recording, having Palmer explain how 911 calls are automatically recorded and stored in the emergency response system, how this particular call was flagged for investigation after the bodies were discovered, and the steps taken to preserve and authenticate the audio. With the foundation laid, Fisher turned to the judge. "Your Honor, the people request that evidence item number 1 be played for the jury at this time." Judge Simmons instructed court officers to prepare the audio system, then addressed the jury. "You are about to hear evidence that may be distressing. You are instructed to listen carefully and evaluate it as you would any other evidence in this case." The courtroom speakers emitted the sounds of Michael Foster's final moments, rustling noises as the phone apparently shifted in his pocket, footsteps on stairs, then Michael's voice saying clearly, "Rain, let's talk about this." Another male voice, identified by Palmer as belonging to Rain Foster, responded, "You sided with them, Mike." 3 distinct dog barks followed, then Rain's voice again, "You chose them over me, your own brother." Michael's response was partially obscured by movement sounds, but the phrase, "Think about your kids," was discernible before the distinctive muffled pop of a silenced gunshot ended the conversation. 47 seconds of audio that captured a man's murder by his brother, played in a silent courtroom where even breathing seemed to have temporarily ceased. As the recording ended, a soft sob could be heard from the victim's family section. Rain Foster sat motionless at the defense table, his expression blank, as he stared straight ahead, avoiding eye contact with both the jury and his former family members. Dr. James Chen adjusted his glasses as he took the witness stand. The court's audio forensics expert, preparing to deliver what would become the most technically detailed testimony of the trial. Prosecutor Victoria Fisher methodically established Dr. Chen's credentials: Ph.D. in acoustic engineering from MIT, 15 years with the FBI's Audio Forensics Unit before establishing Detroit's Municipal Audio Analysis Laboratory, and participation in over 200 criminal cases requiring expert audio authentication. Large monitors displayed spectrographic visualizations of the 911 recording, as Dr. Chen explained to the jury how sound waves create distinctive patterns that can be analyzed like fingerprints. Voice identification through spectrographic analysis is based on the principle that each human voice has unique characteristics created by the physical structure of the vocal cords, oral cavity, and respiratory system, Dr. Chen explained, using a laser pointer to highlight waveform patterns on the screen. These characteristics create identifiable patterns that remain consistent across recordings, allowing for scientific comparison between a known voice sample and questioned audio. Fisher played a series of voice exemplars collected from Rain Foster during police questioning, alongside the corresponding segments from the 911 recording. Dr. Chen walked the jury through the matching vocal patterns, explaining how specific phonetic elements in Rain's speech created identical spectrographic signatures in both recordings. The phrase "you sided with them" contains multiple points of comparison, including a slight stutter on the S sound that appears consistently in both the 911 recording and Mr. Foster's known speech samples. Dr. Chen testified that his analysis concluded with 99.7% certainty that the voice on the 911 recording belonged to Rain Foster, explaining that this percentage exceeded the scientific community's standard for positive identification. Cross-examination by defense attorney Davidoff focused on potential environmental factors that might affect voice analysis, but Dr. Chen remained unshaken, explaining how his methodology accounted for such variables and maintaining that the identification was scientifically valid beyond reasonable doubt. The prosecution's audio evidence extended beyond voice identification to include the distinctive barking of Rain's German Shepherd, Kaiser. Animal vocalization expert Dr. Melissa Randhawa took the stand, explaining how dog barks, like human voices, contain identifiable acoustic signatures based on the animal's physical characteristics. Dogs of the same breed may sound similar to the human ear, Dr. Randhawa testified, but spectrographic analysis reveals distinct patterns unique to individual animals. The jury watched as side-by-side comparisons showed matching patterns between the barks captured on the 911 call and reference recordings of Kaiser made after Rain's arrest. Dr. Randhawa further testified that the background acoustics of the barking indicated the dog was in the same room as the recording device, placing Kaiser, and by extension Rain, at the crime scene at the time of Michael Foster's murder. Defense attempts to suggest the barking could have come from another German Shepherd failed to undermine Dr. Randhawa's certainty about the match, particularly when she noted Kaiser's slightly unusual bark pattern resulting from a minor laryngeal abnormality visible in the spectrogram. Ballistics expert Dr. Thomas Blackburn provided detailed testimony linking the murder weapon to Rain Foster through multiple forensic connections. Holding the recovered Glock 19 in gloved hands, Dr. Blackburn explained how microscopic striations on bullets fired from the gun created ballistic fingerprints unique to that specific weapon. The bullets recovered from all 5 victims show identical striation patterns, Dr. Blackburn testified, displaying magnified images on the courtroom monitors. These patterns match test-fired rounds from this Glock 19 with 100% certainty. The expert further testified that Rain's fingerprints were found beneath the removable backstrap of the gun, a location unlikely to be wiped during cleaning, and that DNA analysis had identified blood from 4 of the 5 victims on the weapon despite apparent cleaning attempts. Dr. Blackburn's testimony methodically dismantled potential defense arguments about the weapon, establishing that the partial filing of the serial number had not completely obscured its match to Rain's registered firearm, and that the silencer recovered from Rain's apartment matched the threading on the Glock precisely. The scientific testimony gave way to emotional accounts as Maria Jones took the stand, Rain's ex-wife testifying about the custody battle that had preceded the murders. Dressed conservatively in a navy blue suit, Maria spoke in a steady voice that occasionally trembled when recounting particularly difficult memories. She described Rain's escalating, controlling behavior during their marriage, including monitoring her phone calls, isolating her from family, and explosive anger episodes that frightened both her and their children. The breaking point came when he punched a hole in the wall next to our son's head during an argument about a school project, Maria testified. That night, when he finally fell asleep, I took the children and went to my parents' house. Fisher guided Maria through the subsequent custody proceedings, where all 5 murder victims had testified about witnessing Rain's concerning behavior. After each hearing, his texts would get more threatening, Maria stated, as the prosecution displayed messages including one sent just days before the murders. "You think your family protected you? They can't protect you forever." Under Fisher's questioning, Maria provided crucial testimony about Rain's narcissistic personality traits that had been referenced in the family court's final ruling. Rain could never accept responsibility for anything that went wrong in our marriage or with the children, she explained. Every problem was someone else's fault, usually mine or my family's. He saw himself as perfect, and any criticism sent him into a rage. Maria described Rain's particular fury when the final custody ruling described him as having narcissistic personality traits that render him currently unsuitable for shared parenting responsibilities. According to Maria, Rain had called her repeatedly after the ruling, ranting that the whole system is corrupt and that her family would regret the day they turned against me. When Fisher asked if Maria had reported these threats to police, she shook her head, eyes downcast. I'd heard his threats so many times before, and he had never actually become physical. I thought it was just more of the same, angry words to intimidate me. I never imagined he would actually hurt anyone. Defense attorney Lawrence Davidoff approached cross-examination of Maria Jones with careful strategy, avoiding any appearance of attacking a sympathetic witness, while still attempting to introduce doubt about Rain's mental state. Ms. Jones, during your marriage to Rain, did he ever speak about his military experiences? Davidoff asked, beginning his effort to introduce the PTSD defense. Maria acknowledged that Rain occasionally mentioned his Army service, but claimed he rarely provided specific details. When pressed about whether Rain had exhibited symptoms like nightmares, hypervigilance, or emotional detachment that might indicate PTSD, Maria's responses were mixed, confirming some such behaviors but attributing them to Rain's personality rather than trauma. Did Rain ever seek professional help for his emotional issues? Davidoff asked. I begged him to get counseling, both for himself and for our marriage, Maria replied. He always refused, saying there was nothing wrong with him, that everyone else was the problem. This response simultaneously supported Davidoff's argument about untreated mental health issues while undermining his attempt to portray Rain as a victim of trauma rather than a man with narcissistic traits. Dr. Vanessa Wilson, the forensic psychiatrist who had evaluated Rain Foster after his arrest, provided critical testimony challenging the defense's PTSD claims. Called by the prosecution specifically to counter Davidoff's diminished capacity arguments, Dr. Wilson testified that her extensive evaluation found no clinical evidence of PTSD meeting diagnostic criteria in Rain Foster. What I did find, Dr. Wilson stated firmly, were clear indicators of narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features, a persistent pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy. The psychiatrist explained how Rain's reactions to the custody loss aligned with narcissistic injury rather than trauma response. Mr. Foster interpreted losing custody not as a concern for his children's well-being, but as a personal attack on his status and self-image. His reaction was rage at this perceived humiliation, not fear or flashbacks consistent with PTSD. Dr. Wilson's testimony included quotes from her clinical interviews with Rain, where he had described his family as traitors who needed to learn their lesson, and showed an absence of genuine remorse, instead expressing anger at being caught and focusing on his own suffering rather than the harm caused to others. Elaine Foster, Michael's widow, provided testimony that humanized the victims while establishing Rain's state of mind in the weeks before the murders. Still wearing her wedding ring 8 months after her husband's death, Elaine described Michael's efforts to maintain a relationship with his brother despite growing concerns about Rain's behavior. Mike always believed people could change if given the chance, she testified, her voice steady despite the grief evident in her expression. He tried to stay neutral in the custody case until he witnessed Rain throw a chair during a family dinner. After that, he felt he had to testify about what he'd seen for the safety of the children. Elaine recalled Rain's reaction after the final custody ruling. He came to our house unannounced, demanding to speak to Mike alone. I heard him shouting that Mike had betrayed him, that blood should stick with blood. When he left, he pointed at Mike and said, "You made your choice. Now you live with it." This testimony established both the threat and premeditation, directly contradicting the defense's portrayal of Rain as someone who snapped under pressure rather than methodically planning revenge. The most technically impressive testimony came from digital forensics expert Aaron Takahashi, who analyzed Rain Foster's online activity in the weeks preceding the murders. Takahashi guided the jury through a timeline of Rain's internet searches, beginning with queries about winning custody appeals and proving judicial bias immediately after losing custody, then escalating to darker searches including famous family annihilators and how to make a homemade silencer. The expert testified about recovered deleted files from Rain's laptop, including a document titled Consequences DocX that contained what appeared to be a list of grievances against each victim, alongside notes about their daily schedules and routines. Most damning was Rain's search history from the day before the murders. Undetectable poisons versus gunshot, which is better? How to clean blood from shoes, and countries with no U.S. extradition. Takahashi further testified about Rain's cell phone location data, which placed him in the vicinity of his brother's home at the time of the murders despite his initial claim to police that he had been home sleeping. Digital evidence that directly contradicted his alibi and supported the premeditation theory. As the prosecution built toward the conclusion of its case, they called the Wayne County medical examiner, Dr. James Patel, who provided clinical but powerful testimony about the manner of death for all 5 victims. Each victim sustained a single gunshot wound to the head, fired at close range, between 6 and 12 inches, in an execution-style manner, Dr. Patel testified, using anatomical diagrams rather than graphic crime scene photos to illustrate his findings. The wound patterns are consistent with the victims being stationary at the time of shooting, with no defensive wounds or signs of prolonged struggle. The medical examiner's testimony established that the murders had been carried out with cold efficiency rather than in the heat of passion, contradicting the defense narrative of a traumatized man who had snapped under pressure. When Fisher asked about the likelihood of all 5 victims being killed so efficiently by someone in an emotionally distressed state, Dr. Patel replied, "In my professional opinion, the consistency of the wound patterns across all 5 victims suggests a controlled, methodical perpetrator rather than someone acting in an emotionally dysregulated state." On the final day of testimony, Prosecutor Victoria Fisher called Detective Nathan Palmer back to the stand to summarize the investigation's findings, providing the jury with a comprehensive narrative that connected all pieces of evidence. Palmer walked through the timeline of the murders using an interactive display that combined security camera footage, cell phone location data, and the 911 call to track Rain Foster's movements on October 3rd. The detective described how Rain had cut the home's security camera wires before entering through the back door using his brother's key, then methodically moved through the house, killing each victim with a single shot to the head. The evidence tells us that Rain Foster committed these murders out of revenge, Palmer testified. He planned carefully, executed precisely, and attempted to cover his tracks afterward. There was nothing impulsive or disorganized about these killings. As Palmer concluded his testimony, Fisher played the 911 recording one final time, ensuring that Rain Foster's own voice, captured in the act of murder, would be the last piece of evidence the jury heard before deliberations began. The jury in the Rain Foster murder trial filed back into courtroom 4B after just 4 hours and 27 minutes of deliberation, their unexpectedly quick return sending a ripple of tension through the packed gallery. Court officers maintained strict decorum as Judge Eleanor Simmons took the bench and instructed the defendant to rise for the verdict. Rain Foster stood beside his attorney, his face impassive as it had remained throughout most of the trial, his gaze fixed on the middle distance rather than on the jury foreperson who now held his fate. The courtroom fell into complete silence as the clerk asked, "Members of the jury, have you reached a verdict?" The foreperson, a middle-aged black woman who had taken meticulous notes throughout the trial, responded clearly, "We have, Your Honor." She handed the verdict form to a court officer who delivered it to Judge Simmons for review before returning it to the foreperson for announcement. In the matter of the people of the state of Michigan versus Rain Foster, on the charge of first-degree murder in the death of Michael Foster, how do you find? The clerk asked. The foreperson's voice was steady and resolute. We find the defendant guilty. A small collective exhale came from the victim's family section, where Elaine Foster grasped Maria Jones's hand tightly. The clerk continued methodically through all 5 counts, with the jury returning guilty verdicts on each charge of first-degree murder for Michael Foster, Robert Jones, Catherine Jones, Jennifer Jones, and Thomas Jones. Rain Foster showed no visible reaction as the verdicts were read, his posture rigid and his expression unchanged, while defense attorney Lawrence Davidoff placed a supportive hand briefly on his client's shoulder. Judge Simmons thanked the jury for their service and announced that sentencing would take place in 2 weeks, ordering Rain Foster returned to custody pending that hearing. Outside the courthouse, prosecutor Victoria Fisher addressed the assembled media with measured professionalism rather than triumph. Today's verdict brings legal closure to one of the most shocking crimes in our city's recent history, but we recognize that no verdict can repair the immense loss suffered by the Foster and Jones families. Fisher credited the swift conviction to the overwhelming evidence, particularly highlighting the unprecedented 911 recording that had captured the actual commission of the first murder. This case demonstrates both the tragedy of family violence and the advancement of forensic science in bringing perpetrators to justice. While we cannot undo the harm inflicted on October 3rd, we can ensure that Rain Foster will never again have the opportunity to harm others. Fisher declined to speculate on the specific sentence, but noted that under Michigan law, first-degree murder carried a mandatory minimum of life imprisonment without possibility of parole, and with 5 convictions, the defendant would face multiple consecutive terms. In a private conference room away from media cameras, the victims' families received the verdict with a complex mixture of relief, grief, and lingering disbelief at the magnitude of their loss. Elaine Foster, who had maintained remarkable composure throughout the trial, finally allowed herself to break down in tears, surrounded by supportive family members and victim advocates. Michael always believed in justice, she told the gathered relatives through tears. He would say the system worked today. Maria Jones faced the additional burden of explaining the outcome to her children, who remained in therapy to process both the loss of their extended family and the knowledge that their father was responsible. The children still ask why, Maria confided to Victim Services Coordinator Denise Williams. How do you explain to a child that their father chose revenge over everything, even them? They're the secondary victims in all this. They lost their father long before he committed these murders, but now they have to live with his legacy. Defense attorney Lawrence Davidoff made brief remarks outside the courthouse, acknowledging the overwhelming evidence while maintaining that mental health factors had not been adequately considered. While we respect the jury's verdict, this case highlights the ongoing failures of our system to address untreated mental health issues, particularly among veterans, Davidoff stated. Rain Foster's actions were indefensible, but they occurred in the context of a man suffering from undiagnosed and untreated psychological trauma, exacerbated by a bitter custody battle. When pressed about potential appeals, Davidoff indicated they would explore all options, but conceded that the evidence, particularly the 911 recording, presented significant challenges to any appeal strategy. Legal analysts commenting on the case noted that the defense had faced a nearly impossible task given the audio evidence capturing the defendant's voice at the crime scene during the commission of the first murder. The swift verdict dominated local news coverage, with Detroit's media analyzing both the crime itself and the broader implications for family court security and mental health intervention. Psychology experts interviewed on evening news programs discussed the narcissistic personality traits that had been central to the prosecution's characterization of Rain Foster, explaining how narcissistic injury, the perceived threat to self-image, can trigger extreme rage in individuals with this disorder. What makes this case particularly disturbing is the calculated nature of the revenge, noted Dr. Catherine Jennings, a forensic psychologist interviewed by Channel 7 News. This wasn't an impulsive crime of passion, but a methodical execution of 5 people who had wronged him by testifying truthfully in court. The extended planning period between the custody ruling and the murders demonstrates how narcissistic rage can simmer and intensify rather than dissipate over time. In the days following the verdict, attention turned to the upcoming sentencing hearing and questions about how Judge Simmons would address the unprecedented nature of 5 first-degree murder convictions. Legal experts noted that while Michigan had abolished the death penalty in 1846, multiple life sentences could be imposed consecutively rather than concurrently, resulting in a symbolic sentence that acknowledged each victim individually. Court watchers speculated that given the heinous nature of the crimes, the judge would likely impose the maximum possible sentence, making Rain Foster ineligible for parole consideration regardless of future changes to Michigan's life imprisonment statutes. The Detroit Free Press published an editorial calling for the maximum sentence, arguing that while rehabilitation remains a worthy goal of our justice system, there are rare cases where public safety and the gravity of the offense require permanent removal from society. The calculated murder of 5 family members surely qualifies as such a case. The verdict brought a measure of closure to the tight-knit Morningside neighborhood where the murders had occurred, though residents acknowledged the community would never fully recover from the trauma. Neighbors who had placed flowers on the Foster home's porch in the days after the murders now tied 5 white ribbons to trees along the street, one for each victim. Community leader Reverend James Harrington organized a prayer service at nearby Grace Methodist Church, where Michael Foster had occasionally volunteered with youth programs. Today's verdict cannot restore what was lost, Reverend Harrington told the congregation, but it affirms that actions have consequences, that justice may be delayed, but rarely denied, and that our community stands with those who have suffered immeasurable loss. The church announced plans to establish a memorial garden on its grounds with 5 flowering trees representing each victim, a living testament to lives cut short by violence stemming from wounded pride and thwarted control. For the investigators who had built the case against Rain Foster, the quick verdict validated their meticulous work while providing little satisfaction given the tragic circumstances. Detective Nathan Palmer, interviewed at police headquarters after the verdict, reflected on the unique aspects of the case. In 15 years investigating homicides, I've never had a case where we actually heard the murder happen on a 911 call. That recording was both our strongest evidence and the most difficult part of this case to process emotionally. Palmer credited the collaboration between traditional detective work and modern forensic science for the successful prosecution, particularly highlighting the audio forensics that had authenticated Rain's voice on the 911 call. Technology caught what Rain Foster never expected, his own voice convicting him of murder. It's a reminder that in our digital age, evidence can be captured in ways perpetrators never anticipate. 2 weeks after the guilty verdicts, Rain Foster returned to Courtroom 4B for sentencing, the final act in a legal drama that had captivated Detroit for months. The sentencing hearing began with victim impact statements, providing family members the opportunity to address both the court and the defendant directly before Judge Eleanor Simmons pronounced her decision. Elaine Foster approached the podium first, composed in a black dress with Michael's wedding ring on a chain around her neck. "My husband believed in second chances," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "Michael saw good in everyone, including his brother Rain, even when that good was hard for others to find. That fundamental decency cost Michael his life." Elaine described the devastating impact of the murders on her 2 young daughters who now suffered from nightmares and required ongoing therapy. "My children will grow up without their father because Rain couldn't accept losing in court. They will miss Michael at every milestone, graduations, weddings, grandchildren, all the moments a father should witness, all stolen by his brother's narcissistic rage." Maria Jones spoke next, addressing Rain directly for the first time since the custody hearings that had precipitated the tragedy. "Our children ask me why their father did this terrible thing," she said, her voice wavering slightly before regaining strength. "What can I possibly tell them? How do I explain that their father chose revenge over everything, over decency, over family, even over his love for them?" Maria described the secondary trauma inflicted on her children, who now carried both the grief of losing their extended family and the stigma of being the murderer's children at school. "You didn't just kill 5 people, Rain. You destroyed your children's sense of safety and trust in the world. You shattered their understanding of what a father should be." As Maria concluded her statement, Rain maintained the same impassive expression he had shown throughout the trial, his eyes focused on the middle distance rather than meeting her gaze. Representatives from the extended Jones family delivered emotional tributes to Robert, Catherine, Jennifer, and Thomas, humanizing each victim beyond the clinical details presented during trial testimony. Robert's brother recounted the elder Joneses' 40 years, building cars at Ford's River Rouge complex, his pride in his American success story after immigrating from Mexico with nothing but determination. Catherine's sister described her award-winning catering business built around traditional family recipes, and how she had planned to publish a cookbook the following year. Jennifer's fiancé spoke through tears about their wedding plans, displaying the save-the-date cards they had selected just days before her murder. Thomas's mentor from graduate school detailed his promising future in social work, cut short just as he had begun his career helping vulnerable children. Each speaker looked directly at Rain Foster while describing the lives he had taken, but he remained expressionless, showing no visible reaction to their grief or accusations. When all impact statements concluded, Judge Simmons asked Rain Foster if he wished to address the court before sentencing, as was his right. Rain rose slowly, his attorney, Lawrence Davidoff, whispering briefly in his ear before he approached the podium. "I have nothing to say," Rain stated flatly, his first and only word spoken during the trial proceedings. This brief statement, devoid of remorse or acknowledgement, sent a ripple of murmurs through the courtroom that Judge Simmons quickly silenced with her gavel. The judge then addressed Rain directly, her normally measured judicial tone taking on an edge of contained anger as she delivered her sentencing remarks. "Mr. Foster, this court has presided over many murder cases during my tenure on the bench, but rarely have I encountered crimes that combine such calculated premeditation with such profound betrayal of familial bonds." Judge Simmons continued her admonishment, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. The evidence presented at trial painted a clear picture, not of a man suffering temporary insanity or acting in the heat of passion, but of a narcissist who could not tolerate losing control. You methodically executed 5 people, your own brother, your former in-laws, members of your extended family, because they dared to testify truthfully in a custody case where your own behavior had already demonstrated your unsuitability as a parent. The judge referenced Dr. Wilson's psychiatric evaluation, which had diagnosed Rain with narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial features. This court finds particularly disturbing your complete lack of remorse throughout these proceedings. You have shown no empathy for your victims, no concern for the trauma inflicted on your own children, and no recognition of the enormity of your crimes. Judge Simmons leaned forward slightly, her gaze fixed on Rain as she delivered the sentence that would make headlines across Michigan and beyond. "Rain Foster, having been found guilty by a jury of your peers on 5 counts of first-degree murder, this court sentences you to 5 consecutive terms of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole." The judge paused momentarily before adding the statement that would be quoted in every news report about the case. "Well, sir, you're going to be perfect for 340 years in prison. The narcissist who couldn't stand losing custody has now lost everything, your freedom, your family, your future. Your name will be remembered only for the lives you took and the pain you caused, while your victims will be remembered for the love they gave and the lives they touched." Rain Foster showed the first crack in his composed facade at these words, a muscle twitching briefly in his jaw before he resumed his blank expression. In the aftermath of the sentencing, the Foster Jones family began the long process of rebuilding shattered lives in a community forever marked by the tragedy. Elaine Foster eventually sold the family home where the murders occurred, unable to return to spaces now defined by violence rather than the happy memories they had once contained. She established the Michael Foster Memorial Scholarship at Renaissance High School, where he had taught, providing college funding for students pursuing education careers. Maria Jones legally changed her children's last name and relocated to another Detroit suburb, seeking anonymity and a fresh start while maintaining connections with Elaine's family. The 2 women, bound by shared tragedy and the challenge of raising children affected by trauma, formed a support system that psychological experts praised as crucial for the children's long-term recovery. Detroit's legal community pointed to the Foster case as evidence of needed reforms in family court security protocols and threat assessment procedures. In direct response to the murders, Wayne County implemented enhanced risk screening for high-conflict custody cases, with parties flagged for concerning behaviors automatically referred for threat assessment by trained professionals. The courthouse where Rain Foster had lost custody installed additional security measures, including panic buttons in all family courtrooms and mandatory safety planning for litigants who expressed fear of retaliation. Domestic violence advocates noted that while these changes represented important progress, they came too late for the 5 victims whose testimony in family court had cost them their lives. The Foster case illustrates the potentially lethal consequences of narcissistic injury in family court settings, explained Dr. Melissa Harper, director of Wayne County's newly established Family Court Safety Initiative. When individuals with certain personality disorders lose control over situations or people they believe they own, the risk of violence escalates dramatically. The unprecedented 911 call that captured Michael Foster's murder became a training tool for law enforcement agencies nationwide, used to educate dispatchers about recognizing and responding to pocket dials that might contain emergency situations. Detroit's 911 call center revised its protocols for ambiguous calls, implementing a tiered response system that required supervisor review of any call containing suspicious sounds or partial conversations before clearing it as a non-emergency. These changes directly address the initial response to Michael's accidental call, when officers performed a cursory welfare check but did not force entry without clear evidence of distress. Training Coordinator Sergeant James Wilson explained the policy change to local media. The Foster case taught us that sometimes the most important emergency calls are the ones where no one directly requests help. We now train our dispatchers to listen for subtle cues and context that might indicate danger, even when direct communication isn't established. The legal and technological aspects of the case garnered attention from law schools and forensic science programs, with the 911 recording becoming a case study in digital evidence. Northwestern University Law School added the Foster trial to its curriculum on digital forensics and criminal evidence, highlighting how the pocket-dialed call had created an unprecedented, real-time audio record of a murder in progress. Forensic audio specialist Dr. James Chen, whose testimony about voice identification had been crucial to the prosecution's case, published a peer-reviewed paper on the authentication techniques used to verify Rain's voice on the recording. The Foster case represents a watershed moment in audio forensics, Chen wrote in the Journal of Forensic Sciences. It demonstrates how everyday technology, in this case, a smartphone's emergency call function, can capture crucial evidence even when no human witness deliberately activates the recording. Mental health professionals use the case to highlight the dangers of untreated personality disorders and the need for better intervention systems. While the defense's attempt to attribute Rain's actions to PTSD had failed, psychological experts noted that his diagnosed narcissistic personality disorder represented a genuine risk factor that had gone unaddressed despite multiple warning signs. Dr. Vanessa Wilson, who had evaluated Rain after his arrest, became an advocate for mandatory mental health screening in high-conflict custody cases. Rain Foster displayed classic warning signs of dangerous narcissistic rage long before he committed murder, Wilson explained in a widely shared TED Talk on the case. His threats were dismissed as merely verbal, his controlling behaviors minimized as typical divorce conflict, and his inability to accept the court's decision was not recognized as the serious risk factor it represented. We must learn to identify these patterns before they escalate to violence. The German Shepherd, Kaiser, whose distinctive bark had helped place Rain at the crime scene, became an unexpected symbol of the case's bizarre elements. Animal Control had initially placed the dog in a shelter after Rain's arrest, but a court battle ensued when Rain's parents-in-law requested custody of the animal that had inadvertently helped convict their daughter's ex-husband. Rain, from prison, fought the request, insisting that Kaiser should go to his former Army colleague rather than the Jones family. The unusual legal question, who should have custody of a dog whose bark helped solve a murder case, generated significant media attention. Judge Simmons ultimately awarded custody to Elaine Foster, who explained her surprising decision. Michael loved that dog despite everything. Kaiser was as much a victim of Rain's choices as anyone else. He doesn't deserve to suffer for his owner's crimes. The German Shepherd eventually became a therapy dog, working with traumatized children, including In a poignant twist, the children who had lost their family members to his former owner's violence. 1 year after the sentencing, Detroit journalist Rebecca Sinclair published The Family Betrayal, a detailed book examining the case from its origins in the custody dispute through the investigation and trial. Sinclair's reporting revealed previously unknown details about Rain Foster's deteriorating mental state in the weeks before the murders, including a consultation with a private investigator about conducting surveillance on his family members and an attempt to purchase life insurance policies on his brother and former in-laws that had been rejected due to lack of insurable interest. The book also explored Rain's prison adjustment, describing him as a model inmate who maintained his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence and who had established himself in a leadership position among other narcissistic and antisocial prisoners. Psychological experts interviewed for the book suggested that Rain's adjustment to prison life reflected his personality disorder. Having lost all external sources of narcissistic supply, he had created a new internal narrative where he was the unjustly persecuted victim, allowing him to maintain his grandiose self-image despite his circumstances. As Detroit approached the second anniversary of the murders, the community continued to process the trauma while honoring the victims' memories through various initiatives and commemorations. Renaissance High School dedicated its renovated history wing to Michael Foster with a plaque bearing his favorite teaching philosophy. We study the past not to be imprisoned by it, but to be liberated from repeating its mistakes. Catherine Jones's family published her cookbook posthumously, with proceeds supporting scholarships for culinary students from immigrant backgrounds. Thomas Jones's colleagues at Child Protective Services established an annual award in his name for excellence in child advocacy. Jennifer Jones's fiancé created a foundation promoting healthy relationships among young adults, conducting workshops about recognizing controlling behaviors and emotional abuse before they escalate. These living memorials transformed grief into community action, creating meaning from senseless violence while ensuring the victims would be remembered for how they lived rather than how they died. The final chapter of the Foster case was written when the Michigan Court of Appeals unanimously rejected Rain's appeal, upholding both the convictions and the 340-year sentence. The three-judge panel specifically addressed the defense's argument that Judge Simmons's narcissist characterization during sentencing had demonstrated bias, ruling instead that her comments were supported by expert testimony and relevant to the factors considered in sentencing. The appellate decision noted the overwhelming evidence, particularly the 911 recording, and concluded that even if other claimed errors had merit, which they do not, the evidence of guilt was so overwhelming that no reasonable jury could have reached a different conclusion. Rain Foster remained in Michigan's maximum security Marquette Branch Prison, where prison officials reported he maintained the same affect-free demeanor he had displayed throughout his trial, seemingly untouched by the devastation he had caused or the lifetime of imprisonment that stretched before him. A textbook case of the narcissistic personality that had driven him to destroy his family rather than accept their testimony against him in court.